Hello and welcome back. I'm Dr. Sage Willis, a psychologist in Washington, and I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about what it means to be transgender. A lot of times people have an idea about it, and a lot of times embedded in that, a lot of times for the clients that I may work with. So I work a lot with people who are in the transgender community, the queer community in general, LGBTQIA+, but I also have a particular interest and focus on working with people who are transgender in some capacity. And, it's important to talk about what this even means, because sometimes people, I've seen this happen where, people will feel like they're not enough. Like they feel like they're not trans enough, and whatever that means, and therefore their concerns aren't valid, or their feelings aren't valid somehow. And then, they can feel like maybe they shouldn't even bother with therapy or something, or maybe sometimes too, people can feel like it's not valid for them to come to therapy because they're not really trans enough somehow. And in the meantime, it's fine to not want therapy, but if you're feeling like this is something that is on your mind and it's eating up a lot of your kind of mental free space, and you're feeling distress because you're not really sure, and you're not sure of who you are, and but you're feeling like you can't really come to therapy because you're not sure enough, that's okay. And I want to invite you to say, or I want to say and invite you by saying that, like, that is the work of therapy. You don't have to have everything figured out, and you don't have to have all of the answers. And this idea of not being trans enough, it's like that's worth talking about. And if it's something that bothers you, and I want to let you know that it's okay not to know, and I mean that, like, wholeheartedly. So that said, let's talk a little bit about what is this idea of transgender. So a lot of times in the media or whatnot, we have this kind of very limited sampling of transgender and transgender people, and as with anything, I mean, you think about, like, the queer community in general. Who do you usually see on TV? It's not usually women, like lesbians. It's not usually people of color who are queer, or people with, like, physical or invisible disabilities. It's just not very diverse at all. Usually you see representations like, say the affluent white cisgender gay couple on Modern Family, which is nice that that's there, but there's a lot more to the queer community than just that. And I realize I just used the word cisgender, and cisgender basically just means that it's a word for people who were assigned a particular gender at birth. So the doctor said it's a boy or it's a girl, and the person's like, yes, I am. Like that is congruent for them. That works for them. The doctor said you're a boy, and the person's never questioned that or never wondered about that, and has always just felt like a boy or a man. for example, or has always felt like a girl, and the doctor said it's a girl, when they're born. So there's a congruence between their gender that they were assigned at birth and the gender that they feel internally. So that's what I mean by cisgender. So that said, cis, it means same side, right? Trans means across. So that's where those terms come from, right? And I believe it's the Latin, as cis is the same and trans is across. But any case, so when I talk about like transgender, the research typically will talk about transgender. The research and the literature will talk about it as a quote-unquote umbrella term. And what this means is that it is a kind of catch-all, or a lot of things are underneath this umbrella of transgender. It's a broad brush for anybody who is not cisgender necessarily. Anybody who does not identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. So that can mean a lot of things, and it's not either or. And that's the thing, we go through life at least in this society, and in this context, like I am in the United States of America, and in this context, culturally, we tend to go through life thinking of things as either or in terms of our gender and our sex. Which bathroom do you use, the boys' room or the girls' room? Which box do you check on that medical form, man or male, female? And things are very like either or like that. But that's not necessarily the case in all cultures, universally, for all people. In fact, a lot of cultures recognize that not everybody is a boy or girl or a man or woman, right? And they have words and they have language to talk about those other genders. So it's something that, so this idea of man, woman, boy, girl, whatever, is not universal to the human experience across all cultures. It's something that is socially constructed within a given particular culture. Our culture, here in the United States, at least, is more into that binary, that dualistic kind of thing of you're this or that, and end of story. And it's that way for gender, and it's also that way for sex, even though medically we know that people are not always necessarily male, female. There are also people who are intersex, and even within this category of intersex, there's a variety of different ways to be intersex. So even something that we imagine is all or nothing, this or that, like biological sex, actually isn't the case. Not everybody is necessarily XX or XY. Surprising. But, fact check me on that. That is something that we socially construct. So, all the more with something, so if that's the case for something, like sex, how much do you think it's going to be binary for things like gender? I mean, define gender, right? So gender is something that is socially constructed. And, now we're starting to get a little bit of wiggle room in society to have people on TV who are transgender. Like, for example, Laverne Cox. Fantastic. Great. And that's, Caitlyn Jenner is another example. So, you have some examples of people who are transgender and are publicly visible. Now, that's one way to be transgender. It's not the only way. So in some cases, people are either, male to female transgender and they want to transition, or they're female to male transgender and they want to transition medically. But that's not the case for everybody. Some people don't identify with their gender that they were assigned at birth, but they also don't necessarily identify 100% as whatever they, society says is the opposite gender, as if it's like, opposite. And that's a silly, false thing anyway. They're not opposite. But I'm saying, like, some people may be assigned male at birth, for example, but they don't feel like they're 100% male, but they don't feel like they're 100% female either. So they might be in this kind of in-between, or this gray area, or maybe they don't feel like they have a gender at all. Maybe they're just like, I'm just me. I don't really have a gender. That still falls within the umbrella of transgender, within like the literature and the research that the sciencey people and the people who like to do research, like what they would count as transgender typically. So it's a spectrum, and not everybody falls in an either or category. So I mentioned in another video, an earlier video, that people may identify as genderqueer, or agender, or neutra, or I've also heard neutrois, depending on your pronunciation. There's so many different ways. Transmasculine, transfeminine, trans boy, trans star, transsexual, trans whatever. Like, there's so many different ways to identify, and the thing is that, again, as I alluded to in a previous video, for such a long time, it just wasn't really okay to talk about this stuff. And so, you have this group of people that's invisible, essentially, and can't really connect until, like, the invention of the internet. Thank goodness for that, but the internet. But, like, there's not really the social power or the ability in the past to start constructing language around this and tailoring language. So it was all very like, you're a transsexual or trans whatever happened to be the word at that time. And now, as people are coming out of the closet and, still not in a position of privilege, but by any means in terms of gender goes, but they're getting enough of a voice to be able to put language to what they're experiencing. And as people do that, the language is shifting and evolving. And so even the terminology, it's like it's constantly evolving and changing, and that's okay. It's going to continue to do that. It needs to do that. But basically, people are finding different ways to express their gender identity, and it doesn't have to be all or nothing. So one thing that is lovely, and so I've been kind of waving this book around, but this is like one resource, and it's backwards on this computer screen here. Actually, yeah, the picture is upside down. It's a little confusing. It's still backwards, though. So this is a social justice advocate's handbook, a guide to gender. And in here they have a discussion of the genderbread person. Now, it's hard to see that on here. Actually, if you go online and you look for the genderbread person, it's a great resource. I printed out a picture of it here, but it's hard to see it, and my camera wants to adjust the lighting and make the lighting go dark on you if I try to hold it up closer to the camera. But in any case, here's maybe there's the QRC code if you want to pause the video, take a picture of that, or you can just like Google the genderbread person. But basically, you know, it makes this point that like everything is on a spectrum, and sometimes different elements of our identity are not necessarily linked together. So like if you're transgender, it doesn't mean that you're gay. You could be, but it doesn't mean that necessarily. And even words like gay are kind of interesting because it assumes kind of a gender binary in some ways, but that's like a whole other discussion for a whole other day. But in any case, language and its limits, good stuff. But in any case, so this is the genderbread person, and I recommend you Googling it or using whatever browser you prefer, Bing, whatever, to go find this little friend. It's, like I said, a great resource. And, you know, it points to how these things are separate. So here is gender identity, and gender identity is in your brain. It's not in your genitals. Your genitals are not necessarily connected to how you experience your gender, okay? And it doesn't necessarily have to tie to who you're attracted to, who you fall in love with, who you're sexually attracted to. You know, you can be, that's a whole other discussion too, is romantic attraction versus sexual attraction and how they can be lined up in different ways or not. But in any case, you know, people can identify on a spectrum in each of these domains, and that's the point of this handout. Aside from illustrating that gender identity, attraction, and sex, and gender expression, so how you present to the outside world as, you know, however you present, how these things are not necessarily linked together in all cases. They can be, but they're not necessarily. So, you know, gender identity, you may identify non-gendered, or, you know, you may identify more with womanness, you know, on this, or manness. It's like these words on this sheet. And, you know, and there's kind of these sliders, and so you can kind of mark where you feel like you're at. You know, and it may not be all the way to one side or another side, and that's okay. Same thing with your gender expression. Maybe you feel very feminine on the inside, but outwardly you appear super like conventionally masculine, and that's okay. You can be like a hardcore, big muscly bodybuilder person, you know, and like super macho masculine and still be super girly on the inside, and that's okay. They don't have to be linked and one doesn't necessarily make the other valid or invalid. Biological sex. Again, you can fall on a spectrum, and people do fall on a spectrum. So you may have biological sex that, you know, falls more on this female spectrum or more on this male side of the spectrum. You can fall anywhere in between. You can be intersex. That's okay. And again, attraction, you can be attracted to nobody. You can be asexual, aromantic. That's all right. You know, or you could be like, you know, I'm attracted to men or maleness or just masculinity. You can be attracted to like masculine women, whatever, and that's fine. Like, you know, if you have like whatever you feel like is you know, you do you, and that's okay. So point in case being, these things are not necessarily linked, and, you know, the human experience is not either or in a lot of cases. So, you know, if you feel like, you know, it's something that you want to talk about, you feel like it's something that's on your mind, something you're wondering about, it's just a conversation, and, you know, it's okay. So, yeah. And having the conversation doesn't necessarily lock you in forever and ever and ever into being anywhere in particular. on any one of these scales. You know, it's funny, like some people actually do feel gender fluid. So it's like one day they'll feel very, very much one way, and then another day they'll feel very much another way, and that's okay, and that's valid. Gender fluid is a thing. So, and it's a very real thing and a very okay thing to be. So, you know, there's many, many ways to be transgender, and wherever you find yourself on the spectrum, or not even on the spectrum, you know, you're okay, like exactly where you're at. And if you're processing and you're discovering, that's part of your journey, and that's just part of being human, and that's okay too. So, yeah. So I just want to put that out there. And, you know, again, this is a good resource. Social Justice Advocates Handbook, A Guide to Gender. Another one that I really like, I don't have a hard copy here. I have a copy, a digital copy, a Kindle copy, because it's like this big monster book. I didn't want to like lug around, but it's a great book. And I really recommend, if you can get your hands on a copy, I would call it, like, at least at this time point here in 2016, the transgender Bible. Like, you want to know about something related to being transgender, this is a great book. And it's called Trans Bodies, Trans Selves. And so, and it's, like I said, it's like this big book, but if you, you know, just do a quick search. It's not hard to find on like Amazon or something, or, you know, if you want to support your local bookstore, you could probably, they could probably order it, or even support your library and ask them to order a copy if you want to just, you know, rent a library copy. It's definitely worth picking up. And you're going to find just all sorts of chapters on pretty much anything you wanted to know about being transgender, whether it's transgender history or, you know, medical treatments and questions about things like hormones or surgeries or whatnot. Definitely worth looking into, at least to get some basic information about a wide range of things, written by authors who definitely know their stuff. So I recommend that. Trans Bodies, Trans Selves. That's a great book. But yeah, in general, you know, like I said, feel free to explore, feel free to be you, and again, wherever you're at, you're absolutely okay. So with that, I want to wish you a good rest of your day, and you take care, right?